I stood beneath a merciless sky, every heartbeat a thunderclap in my ears as I stared into the void where my son's future should have been. The world around me blurred into a haze of grief and fury, each second a torturous reminder of everything I'd lost. In that agonizing moment, I felt betrayed not only by fate but by the one person who was meant to be my partner in this life. While I knelt beside the freshly dug grave of my 15-year-old son, my pride, my joy, my reason for hope, my wife was in Las Vegas with her lover, laughing as if life had no meaning. The first 100 words of my torment etched themselves into my soul, the visceral sting of abandonment, the desperate yearning for answers, and the unbearable weight of a love that had been severed at its core. I remember the day vividly, the day that turned my entire existence into a nightmare I could neither wake from nor escape. It was supposed to be a day of remembrance, a day to celebrate the life of our son who had been full of promise despite the battles he fought every day. Instead, it became the stage for a tragedy so profound that every moment since has been drenched in sorrow. I arrived at the funeral home early that morning, my heart heavy with dread, only to find a silence so thick it almost suffocated me. Every step I took toward the chapel felt like a descent into darkness, as if each footfall was dragging me further away from any hope of salvation. Inside the small, crowded chapel, murmurs of condolences filled the air, but they did nothing to ease the crushing reality. I could see the sorrow in the eyes of friends and relatives, but their sympathy was a distant echo compared to the roaring pain within me. I had barely managed to process the loss of our son when another devastating truth tore through the remnants of my shattered heart. My wife was not there. In the midst of our collective mourning, I discovered that she had chosen to abandon me in the worst way possible. Instead of standing by my side, of clinging to the memory of the family we once had, she had flown off to Las Vegas, spending our precious time with her lover. That bitter knowledge was a poison I could not escape, a betrayal that reeked of deceit and callous indifference. As the service began, I took my seat at the back of the chapel, every eye on me reminding me that I was alone in my grief. I closed my eyes, trying desperately to block out the stinging sound of whispered condolences and the soft rustle of tissue paper. My mind kept replaying the final moments we had shared as a family, the chaotic scene at home that had led us here. I remembered our son's excited chatter as he prepared for his final high school performance, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams of a future that now would never come to pass. I recalled how he had always looked to me for guidance, and how I had promised him that I would be there for every step of his journey. That promise was now a cruel reminder of the father I could no longer be. In that moment I felt my rage rising like a tidal wave. How could she do this? How could the person who had vowed to share in every joy and sorrow choose to forsake me at the very moment when I needed her most? The absurdity of her actions gnawed at me, twisting my insides with an anger so fierce it nearly paralyzed me. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It felt like a public spectacle, a stark contrast between her carefree laughter in a neon-lit casino and my silent suffering amid the somber tones of a funeral service. Every fiber of my being screamed injustice, every thought a bitter lament for what might have been if she had chosen to honor our family, rather than indulge in her selfish pursuits. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, the leather cold against my skin as the minister began his eulogy. His words, meant to comfort, only deepened the void inside me. He spoke of eternal rest and the peace that awaited our son, but those words meant nothing to me now. I could not imagine a peace that could ever fill the space where his laughter once rang out so clearly in our home. My eyes welled with tears that I fought to keep hidden, not out of pride, but because I was terrified of letting the full scope of my pain be seen by those around me. I didn't want pity, didn't want the hollow reassurances of strangers, I just wanted the searing pain to stop. After the eulogy, as the casket was slowly lowered into the earth, I felt as if time had ceased to exist. The sound of the spade breaking the soil seemed to echo in my ears like the relentless pounding of my broken heart. I remembered the day we had laid the foundation for our dreams, when our son was a baby and the world was full of endless possibilities. That foundation had been built with so much love and hope, and now it was being buried under layers of regret and betrayal. In that surreal moment, every laugh, every tear, every whispered promise of tomorrow turned to dust beneath the weight of an unforgiving reality. I remember stepping out of the cemetery later, my hands trembling as I tried to grasp the fragments of my own identity. The biting wind did little to cool the burning rage and sorrow that churned inside me. My mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, anger, despair, and a desperate, gnawing loneliness that I had never known before. I wandered aimlessly along the barren roadside, the barren landscape a mirror to the emptiness that had taken hold of my soul. I was lost, both physically and emotionally, in a world that had become hostile and indifferent to my pain. That evening, I found myself sitting in the back of a rundown diner, the neon sign outside flickering in the rain-soaked darkness. I stared into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, the bitter taste matching the bitterness in my heart. Every sip was a reminder of the life I once had, a life filled with shared dreams and mutual support, now reduced to ashen memories. I couldn't help but question the cruelty of it all. How could someone who had once been my confidant and partner in life choose to erase her own humanity at a moment when I needed her empathy the most? Memories of our happier times flashed through my mind like fragments of a once beautiful film now marred by the harsh realities of betrayal. I recalled our first meeting, the instant connection that had seemed to promise forever. I remembered the warmth of her smile, the sincerity in her eyes, and how we had vowed to stand together against the world's hardships. But as I sat there drowning in my own despair, I could see that promise shattered, lost in the wake of her selfish choices. It wasn't just the loss of our son that haunted me now, it was the loss of trust, the crumbling of everything I believed in. In that diner, a kindly waitress came over and set a slice of pie in front of me, her eyes filled with unspoken sympathy. I must have looked like a man on the verge of collapse, and she offered a gentle smile as if to say, "I understand your pain." I managed a weak nod, but her kindness did little to quell the storm raging within me. I knew that no amount of comforting words or warm pie could ever mend the void that had been carved out of my life. Instead, I was left with a raw, unfiltered sense of betrayal, a feeling that was both personal and profoundly isolating. As night descended, the neon lights of the diner blended with the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. I stepped outside and found myself wandering the streets, every step taking me further from the world I once knew. The cold air bit at my skin, a constant reminder of the harsh reality that I had to face. My son was gone, and the woman who was supposed to share my grief was miles away, wrapped up in her own twisted pursuit of pleasure. Each step was a journey into the depths of my own despair, a painful trek through the ruins of a life that had been ripped apart by choices I never saw coming. In the solitude of the night, I allowed my thoughts to wander freely, revisiting every moment of my past with a new, painful clarity. I recalled the day I discovered her secret, the way her phone vibrated with messages she desperately tried to hide, the furtive glances she exchanged with a stranger. I had dismissed those signs as mere coincidences, the quirks of a busy life, but now they stood as irrefutable evidence of a betrayal that had been brewing long before our son's tragic fate. The memories pained me, each one a jagged shard of glass cutting deeper into my already wounded heart. I found myself grappling with questions that had no answers. How did I not see it sooner? Was I so blinded by my own hopes that I refused to acknowledge the truth? The answers eluded me, slipping away like sand through my fingers. Instead, I was left with the crushing certainty that my life would never be the same again. I had lost not only my son but also the person I once trusted with my deepest secrets and my wildest dreams. In the quiet of the night, the city's neon lights flickered in a mocking dance, as if celebrating the tragedy of my existence. Everywhere I looked, I saw fragments of our past, a faded photograph in a dusty window, a familiar street corner where we once laughed together, the echo of our voices mingled with the hum of a life that had once been so full of promise. Now these relics of happier times only deepened the wounds. They reminded me of a love that had been as vibrant as it was fragile, a love that had been shattered by choices made in the pursuit of fleeting pleasures. My wife's absence, her decision to forsake the family we had built, was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical pain. It was a violation of the sacred trust we had once shared, and as I trudged along the empty streets, the weight of that betrayal pressed down on me like an unyielding force. The hours passed slowly as I wandered, my mind a swirling vortex of memories and regrets. I recalled the quiet moments we had shared, early mornings filled with whispered promises, long nights spent dreaming of a future that now lay in ruins. I remembered how our son used to run into the kitchen, his laughter filling the house with a contagious joy that could light up even the darkest of days. That joy was gone now, replaced by an endless, echoing silence that swallowed every corner of my heart. The juxtaposition of his gentle spirit against the cruel reality of our loss was almost too much to bear. At one point, I found myself sitting on a park bench beneath a street lamp, the cool metal of the bench offering little comfort compared to the overwhelming coldness of my despair. I thought about calling her, demanding answers, trying to understand how she could have left us in such a moment of pain. But I knew that any conversation would be futile. There was no excuse that could justify the depths of her betrayal. My phone lay silent in my hand, a mute witness to the calamity that had unfolded. The silence of that device was a stark contrast to the cacophony of emotions that swirled within me, a maelstrom of grief, rage, and a desperate need for closure that I knew would never come. In that moment of stillness, I made a silent vow to honor our son's memory, even as I struggled to understand the meaning of it all. I promised myself that I would carry forward the pieces of him that remained, that I would strive to rebuild a life from the ruins of this heart-wrenching tragedy. Yet, the weight of the promise was immense, a constant reminder of the life that was ripped away too soon, and the family that had been fractured beyond repair. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I finally rose from the bench, feeling both exhausted and strangely resolute. The night had been a relentless journey through the darkest corners of my soul, but in that darkness, I had also glimpsed a spark, a fragile determination to forge a future, no matter how shattered my present might be. I knew that the road ahead would be long and painful, littered with memories that would both haunt and guide me. The betrayal, the loss, the abandonment by the one person I had trusted most, all of it would be a part of me, etched into my very being. With each step I took back toward the remnants of the life I once knew, I carried with me the fierce love for my son, a love that would not be extinguished by sorrow or betrayal. Even as I mourned the absence of his laughter and the light he had brought into our home, I clung to the belief that he would want me to keep fighting, to keep living despite the unbearable pain. And though my wife's decision to be in Las Vegas with her lover served as a constant, searing reminder of everything that had gone wrong, it also steeled my resolve to rebuild a life worthy of his memory. I returned home to an empty house, each room echoing with the ghostly remnants of happier times. The silence was deafening, and as I walked through the halls, I could almost hear his footsteps, almost feel his presence in the spaces where he once filled every corner with life and laughter. I sat in his room, the faded posters on the walls and the scattered belongings a testament to a life that had been so brutally taken from us. I vowed, amidst tears and broken whispers, that I would find a way to honor him, to carry on his dreams even as I grappled with the betrayal of the one person who should have been my rock. In the days that followed, I found myself grappling not only with grief but with a profound sense of isolation. Friends and family reached out, offering condolences and support, but their words were like echoes in a vast, empty canyon. I felt as if I were drowning in a sea of sorrow, each wave of grief more powerful than the last, dragging me deeper into despair. The image of my wife's carefree smile in Vegas became a recurring nightmare, a grotesque symbol of a love lost and a betrayal too vast to comprehend. Yet, in the midst of that overwhelming darkness, I began to see a glimmer of something else, the faint outline of resilience. I started to piece together the fragments of my shattered identity, determined to forge a path forward even as every step felt like a descent into further heartache. I sought solace in quiet moments, in the memories of our son's laughter and the promise he had embodied. I began to understand that while the wounds might never fully heal, they could serve as a reminder of the depth of love I had for him, a love that would one day give me the strength to rise again. This journey, as painful as it was, marked the beginning of a long process of healing and reckoning. I started to write down my thoughts, each sentence a cathartic release of the emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. I poured out my sorrow, my anger, and my desperate need for understanding onto paper, trying to capture the raw, unfiltered truth of what I was experiencing. In those words, I found a measure of solace, a way to transform the anguish into something tangible, something that might one day help me rebuild the life that had been so cruelly torn apart. I know now that this story of betrayal and loss is only the beginning of a much longer journey, a journey through grief, forgiveness, and the slow process of reclaiming a future from the ruins of yesterday. Though my wife's absence in my darkest hour will forever remain a wound that time cannot heal, I am determined to honor my son's memory by living a life that reflects the love and hope he once embodied. And so, as I stand here today on the precipice of an uncertain future, I carry with me the strength of his spirit, the echoes of his laughter, and the unyielding belief that even in the face of betrayal, love can endure. Now, as the first chapter of this tragic tale comes to a close, I am left with more questions than answers. How do you rebuild a life when every foundation has crumbled beneath you? How do you find forgiveness in the wake of such profound betrayal? The answers are elusive, hidden somewhere in the labyrinth of my grief, waiting to be discovered as I slowly learn to navigate this new, fractured existence. One thing remains certain: I will not let the darkness define me. I will keep fighting for the memory of my son, for the love we once shared, and for the hope that one day I might find a way to heal. The journey ahead is daunting, filled with obstacles and moments of despair. But as I take my first tentative steps away from the tomb of my past, I am reminded that even in the deepest darkness, there is a spark, a fragile ember of resilience that refuses to be extinguished. My son's memory will be my guiding light, and though my heart is heavy with loss, it beats with a newfound determination to honor his life by striving for a future that, in some small way, reflects the promise he once held. And so, I move forward into the unknown, carrying the weight of betrayal and sorrow as both a burden and a testament to the enduring power of love. In the weeks that followed that bitter day, life became an endless loop of raw grief and simmering anger. I woke each morning to a world that felt both unbearably empty and chaotically indifferent. The house was silent except for the constant echo of memories, the sound of our son's laughter in the hallways, the gentle murmur of his voice that once filled every corner of our home, and the ghostly absence of the warmth I had once known. Every object, every photograph, every misplaced toy was a testament to a life that had been stolen from me. But even in the darkest moments of my despair, a small, persistent ember of determination began to glow, an inner promise that I would find a way to carry on and honor his memory. The days melded together as I tried to navigate a world that no longer made sense. I found myself retracing the steps of that dreadful morning, each moment etched in my mind like a cruel scar. I would often sit by the window watching the rain streak the glass, each drop a painful reminder of the tears I no longer felt like shedding. I spent hours in solitude, grappling with the dual pain of losing our son and the unbearable betrayal of the one person I had trusted with my heart. I questioned everything, my choices, my judgment, and even my own worth. Yet amid that inner storm, I began to realize that wallowing in misery would not bring my son back. Instead, I had to find a way to transform this agony into a force that would help me rebuild my life from the ruins. One morning, as the first light crept over the horizon, I sat down at the old wooden desk that our son had once used to do his homework. The desk was still cluttered with remnants of a happier time, scattered pencils, a frayed notebook, and a faded photograph of the three of us smiling together at the park. I picked up the photograph, running my fingers over the smiling faces, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel something other than the crushing sorrow. I felt a surge of love, a deep, aching love for my son that refused to die, even as his physical presence had been wrenched away. In that moment, I made a vow. I would honor him by living a life that celebrated the goodness he embodied, by turning this pain into a legacy of hope rather than bitterness. Determined to find meaning amid the chaos, I began to seek solace in unexpected places. I reached out to his teachers, his friends' parents, and even some of the neighbors who had known him since he was a toddler. Their memories of him were gentle and full of admiration, a mosaic of his kindness, his wit, and his unyielding spirit. Each story they told, each tearful recollection, began to stitch together a tapestry of a life lived beautifully despite its brevity. Slowly, the narratives of his courage and his unwavering optimism ignited a spark of resilience in me. I started to document these memories in a journal, a way to both preserve his legacy and to confront my grief head-on. With every word I wrote, I felt a weight lift, however slightly, as if I were piecing together the fragments of a broken heart. I remember one afternoon in particular when a kindly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, stopped by with a tray of warm empanadas and a gentle smile. Over coffee and quiet conversation, she told me how my son had once helped her carry groceries up the stairs, how his laughter had brightened her gloomy days, and how his spirit had touched everyone in our community. He was a bright light even on the darkest days, she said softly. Those words resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. They reminded me that while his physical form was gone, his spirit lived on in the hearts of all who had known him. That day, I realized that the path to healing was not one I had to walk alone. The community's outpouring of love became a salve for my wounded soul, a reminder that even in the aftermath of unbearable loss, human connection could rebuild what was shattered. Yet, the sting of betrayal by my wife continued to haunt me. In the quiet moments before sleep, I would replay the evidence of her absence. The unanswered calls, the text messages from an unknown number, the final realization that she had chosen Las Vegas and her lover over the family we had built. There was a part of me that wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation for her callousness. But every time I thought of the confrontation, I was overwhelmed by a paradoxical mix of anger and despair. I realized that the wound was too deep to be healed by words alone. I needed to forgive, not for her sake but for my own. And forgiveness, I discovered, was not a single act but a journey, a gradual letting go of the need to control the narrative of my own pain. Late one night, as I sat alone in the dim glow of a street lamp outside my home, I found myself dialing her number. My hand trembled as I pressed the call button, my mind a maelstrom of emotions. The phone rang and rang until finally, after what felt like an eternity, it went to voicemail. I left a message, a shaky, halting message that was as much an expression of my grief as it was a desperate plea for closure. I didn't expect a response. Deep down, I knew that she had long since closed the door on any semblance of our shared past. And yet, I needed to speak my truth aloud, to let the words tumble out in an act of release. In the days that followed that phone call, I began attending a local support group for parents who had lost children. The meetings were held in a modest community center, where strangers gathered each week to share their stories of loss, hope, and resilience. Listening to their journeys, I felt less isolated in my grief. Each story, though unique in its details, echoed a common refrain, a determination to honor their children's memories by forging forward, even when every step was mired in sorrow. In that safe space, I found the courage to speak about my own pain, to confront the multifaceted aspects of my loss, the grief for my son and the sting of betrayal that had left me feeling utterly abandoned. As I recounted my story, I was met with understanding nods and empathetic eyes that made me realize I was not alone in this struggle. Those sessions became a vital part of my healing process, a weekly reminder that even the darkest nights can give way to a dawn filled with compassion and mutual support. One particularly poignant meeting was led by a woman named Carol, whose calm demeanor and quiet strength inspired everyone around her. She spoke of her own journey with loss, a child taken too soon, a marriage that had crumbled under the weight of unspoken grief, and encouraged us to seek meaning in our pain. "It's not about forgetting," she said, "but about learning to live with the memory of those we've lost in a way that enriches our lives rather than confines us to sorrow." Her words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with the vow I had made on that fateful morning by my son's grave. I began to see that while I could never replace what was lost, I could transform my heartbreak into a force for change, for honoring his life in a way that embraced the fullness of his spirit. With time, I found new outlets for my grief. I started volunteering at the local community center, helping other parents who were grappling with similar tragedies. I organized small memorial events where families could share memories, create scrapbooks, and plant a tree in honor of their loved ones. These acts of kindness, though small in the grand tapestry of life, became beacons of hope for those of us drowning in despair. I realized that healing was not a solitary endeavor, it was a collective journey of resilience and shared strength. In the quiet moments after each event, I would sit under a newly planted tree, its fragile leaves swaying in the breeze, and I felt as though my son's spirit was with me, urging me to keep moving forward. As the months turned into a year, the raw edges of my grief began to soften ever so slightly. The constant ache in my heart was still there, a reminder of a wound that might never fully heal, but it was no longer all-consuming. I had learned to navigate the shifting landscape of loss, to honor my past while cautiously stepping into the future. I began to find solace in simple routines, a morning walk in the park, the familiar comfort of a favorite song, the gentle embrace of a memory shared with a friend. These moments, while small, served as anchors in a life that had been swept up in turmoil. Yet, the matter of my wife still loomed large in my mind. There were nights when I would stare into the darkness, haunted by the ghost of betrayal, wondering how someone could so callously abandon their family at the very moment of tragedy. I had long since stopped expecting an apology or an explanation. Instead, I sought to understand that her choices were a part of her own flawed humanity, a complexity I had once been too naive to comprehend. In the solitude of my introspection, I found that clinging to anger only chained me to the past. If I were to honor my son's memory, I needed to free myself from the venom of resentment, even if it meant accepting that some questions would remain unanswered. I started writing letters, ones that I never sent, to express my feelings. In these letters, I poured out my anger, my sorrow, and ultimately, my reluctant forgiveness. I wrote to my wife, telling her about the moments when I had almost believed that hope could exist despite everything. I wrote to my son, describing the joy he had brought into my life and the promise I had made to carry on his legacy. With each word, I felt as though I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost in the storm of grief. The act of writing became a form of therapy, a private conversation with my own soul that slowly began to mend the fractures within me. One day, after one particularly cathartic writing session, I found myself standing at the edge of the river that ran through our town. The water rushed by relentlessly, indifferent to the tragedies it carried along its banks. I knelt by the riverbank and, almost without realizing it, began to let go of the pieces of paper filled with my confessions. I watched as the water carried them away, scattering my words into the current. In that moment, I felt a curious sense of liberation, the symbolic washing away of my burdens, even if only for a fleeting moment. I knew that the scars of my loss would remain, but I also understood that healing was possible if I allowed myself to trust the passage of time. The process of reclaiming my soul was not linear. There were setbacks, days when the pain would return in waves so strong that I found myself back at that park bench, questioning every decision I had ever made. I had moments of overwhelming loneliness, when the thought of facing another day seemed too unbearable. But in those moments, I reminded myself of the love that had once defined my life, the love that still pulsed through the memories of my son and the community that had rallied around me. Each setback was a lesson, each tear a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Gradually, I began to rebuild not just my own life but also the legacy of our son. I dedicated time to causes he had cared about, setting up a scholarship in his name for underprivileged students, supporting youth programs at the community center, and even organizing an annual memorial run that brought together families and friends to celebrate life even as they mourned loss. These acts of service became the scaffolding upon which I built a new identity, one that honored his memory while embracing the possibility of renewal. In every step I took, I felt a part of him guiding me, a quiet assurance that his light would continue to shine even in the darkest of times. There were still nights when I would lie awake, the silence of the room echoing with unspoken questions. But I began to understand that healing was not about forgetting or erasing the past, it was about integrating the pain into the mosaic of who I had become. I learned that it was possible to carry the memory of loss without being defined by it, to nurture hope even as grief lingered like a shadow. My son's legacy became the catalyst for change, a reminder that love, though sometimes broken and betrayed, could still be a source of unimaginable strength. I eventually reached a point where I was able to sit down with a counselor, someone who helped me unravel the complex tapestry of emotions I had woven over the past year. In our sessions, I confronted not only the heartbreak of losing my child but also the betrayal inflicted by the person I had once trusted implicitly. It was a painful confrontation with my own vulnerability, a journey through the darkest corners of my soul where anger, sorrow, and regret resided. With time, I began to see that while my wife's choices had irrevocably altered the course of my life, they did not have to dictate my future. I learned to accept that some chapters are closed forever, and that the next pages, though uncertain, could be written with intention and compassion. As the seasons changed, so did the landscape of my emotions. The once constant storm of grief had calmed to a steady drizzle, a reminder that while the pain of loss might never vanish entirely, it could become a part of me without overwhelming every moment of my existence. I started to embrace the small joys that came my way, a smile from a stranger, a kind word from a friend, the simple pleasure of a sunset over the river. In these moments, I found a quiet resilience, a determination to live for the sake of my son and for myself. One crisp autumn day, I returned to the cemetery, this time not as a man shattered by loss, but as someone who had learned to carry his memories with dignity. Standing by my son's grave, I spoke softly to him, telling him about the steps I had taken, the people I had met, and the hope that was slowly rekindling within me. "I'm still here, my boy," I whispered, "and I promise to keep living, to keep loving, so that your light can shine through every dark corner of my life." The wind carried my words away, and for a moment, I felt a profound connection to him, a reassurance that even in death he was a part of everything I did. I never did hear from my wife. Her silence became a final, unspoken confirmation of the choices she had made. Over time, I learned that I could no longer allow her absence to define me. Instead, I began to see her as part of a painful chapter that I had already closed, a lesson in the fragility of trust and the importance of forging my own path. I realized that forgiveness was not about condoning her actions but about freeing myself from the endless cycle of blame and resentment. In the end, I discovered that the journey of healing was not a solitary road, but one paved with shared stories, quiet acts of kindness, and a relentless will to persevere. My son's legacy had become the guiding star that illuminated my darkest nights, a beacon that reminded me that even after the most devastating loss, the human spirit could find a way to rise again. I resolved to live each day in honor of him, to channel my pain into acts of compassion, and to continue building a future that celebrated life rather than mourning its absence. Now, as I sit at my desk with the evening sun casting long shadows across the room, I feel the weight of the past but also the stirring of hope for tomorrow. The journey that began with betrayal and heartbreak has led me to a place of quiet resilience, a place where I can acknowledge the pain without letting it dictate every moment of my life. I know that the scars will remain and the memories of our son will forever be a part of me, but I also know that it is possible to live in the light of those memories, to let them inspire rather than destroy. My wife's choice to leave me in the midst of unimaginable loss will always be a bitter chapter in my story, but it is no longer the defining one. I have learned that life, despite its cruelty, holds the possibility of renewal. I have learned that love, true enduring love, is not so easily extinguished by betrayal or sorrow. It flickers on, a quiet flame that warms the soul even on the coldest of nights. And so, I continue my journey, step by determined step, honoring the past while forging a new future. I carry with me the lessons of my son's brief but beautiful life, the memories of a family once whole, and the hope that even in the face of betrayal, life can be rebuilt. Each day is a testament to resilience, a promise that the love we share with those we have lost can guide us through even the most harrowing storms. In the end, I stand not as a broken man, but as one who has been remade by his suffering. A man who has discovered that even after the deepest betrayal, the human heart can learn to beat again with hope, compassion, and a fierce determination to live a life worthy of the memories that light our way. And though my son is no longer here to see the future we once dreamed of, his spirit lives on in every act of kindness I perform, every dream I pursue, and every day I choose to rise and honor his legacy. This is not the end of my story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. One in which grief transforms into strength, betrayal into wisdom, and the memory of my son into a beacon that guides me toward a future filled with light, love, and endless possibility.